Goodbye. I've got this dance with her.
With who?
With Isabel, of course.
In 1942, Orson Welles made his second film. He was 26 years old, fresh off Citizen Kane, and many who saw his original cut believed it was even better. You will never get to judge for yourself, because while Welles was thousands of miles away in Brazil, his own studio took the film apart. They cut roughly 43 minutes out of it. They threw away his ending and shot a cheerful new one without him. And then they did something almost unthinkable. They physically destroyed the footage they had removed. It was melted down, burned, gone. The Magnificent Ambersons survives today only as a shortened, studio-altered fragment of the film Welles actually made. This is the story of how a masterpiece was cut down and then erased. After Citizen Kane, Orson Welles had a problem most directors would envy. How do you follow the film many consider the greatest ever made? His answer was The Magnificent Ambersons, an adaptation of Booth Tarkington's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about a wealthy American family slowly destroyed by its own pride and by the arrival of the automobile age. Welles wrote the screenplay, produced it, directed it, and narrated it himself. He never appears on screen. He cast Joseph Cotten and Agnes Moorehead from his Mercury company, with Tim Holt and Dolores Costello. His cinematographer, Stanley Cortez, helped him build long, shadow, deep-focus shots that pushed even further than Citizen Kane. When Welles assembled his cut, it ran well over 2 hours. Those who saw it in early 1942 described something extraordinary, darker, sadder, and more ambitious than anything Hollywood was making. It was, by many accounts, the best work of his life. Here is where the tragedy begins, and it begins with paperwork. On Citizen Kane, Welles had famously held absolute final cut authority, the power that let him override the studio. On The Magnificent Ambersons, that protection was weaker. His contract gave him control over the edit only through the film's first public preview. After that preview, the studio could step in. Welles's business manager, Jack Moss, was left handling these arrangements, and film historians have been blunt that the contractual protections were not what they should have been. It is one of the bitter ironies of the story. The director who had just shown Hollywood what Final Cut power could protect walked into his second film without that same shield. Everything that happened next flowed from that single contractual gap, the studio's right to take over, the moment the previews went badly. In February 1942, with editing on The Magnificent Ambersons still underway, RKO sent Welles to Brazil. The reason was not a whim. The United States had just entered the Second World War, and the government's good neighbor policy aimed to keep South American countries on the side of the Allies. Welles was asked to make a goodwill documentary, It's All True, as a piece of cultural diplomacy. He agreed out of patriotism and because RKO encouraged it, but it meant that at the most dangerous moment in his film's life, the director left the country. He could not sit in the editing room. He could not be in the previews. He could not walk into an executive's office and fight. He tried to finish the film from another continent. According to RKO's own records, reels of the film were shipped to him in Brazil so he could keep editing remotely. It was an impossible way to protect a movie. What followed was one of the strangest editing processes in studio history. Welles tried to direct the cutting of his own film by cable and telegram from Rio de Janeiro, with a several thousand-mile gap between him and the editing bench. His editor in Los Angeles was a young man named Robert Wise, who would later become a major director himself of West Side Story and The Sound of Music. Welles sent detailed notes on how the film should be shaped. One famous memo ran to dozens of pages. But notes are not the same as being in the room. Some of Welles's own remote instructions, when executed, did not play the way he imagined. The distance turned every decision into a guessing game. And crucially, Welles was still relying on the assumption that he would get to approve the final version. That approval never happened. On the night the film was first previewed for a real audience, in Pomona, California, things went wrong. The Magnificent Ambersons was long, slow, and deeply melancholy, and it was screened immediately after a light, breezy musical. The audience, primed for entertainment, reportedly grew restless. Some laughed at the wrong moments. Some walked out. To the RKO executives in the room, it looked like a catastrophe. But the full truth is more complicated and worth being honest about. Of the comment cards filled out that night, a substantial number were actually positive, some enthusiastic. Film historians have argued the disaster was partly real and partly a story the studio told itself, shaped by Hollywood's existing dislike of Welles after Citizen Kane. Either way, the executives had what they wanted, a reason to act. And the contract said that after the preview they could. After the previews, RKO took control of the Magnificent Ambersons. Welles was still in Brazil. The studio, led by executives anxious about the money tied up in the picture and impatient with its somber tone, began reshaping the film into something they believed audiences would accept. Welles sent memo after memo. He proposed his own cuts to shorten the film while keeping its dark spirit intact. Some of his suggestions were used, many were ignored. The decisions that mattered most were now being made by people who wanted a shorter, lighter, more commercial movie, the opposite of what Welles had built. By the time the studio was finished, the film had been cut from over 2 hours down to just 88 minutes. Roughly 43 minutes of Welles's film were removed. And the studio did not stop at cutting. The cuts were not the worst of it. The studio also decided that Welles's ending was too bleak. In his version, the story closed on a note of loss and reckoning, consistent with everything that came before. RKO wanted the audience to leave happy. So, with Welles still absent, they reshot the ending. The new, more cheerful conclusion was directed not by Welles but by studio hands. The assistant director and others stepped in to film and assemble replacement scenes. The result was a film with two authors stitched together. Welles's dark, deep-focused tragedy for most of its length, and then a tacked-on, conventional, reassuring finish that he never wrote and never approved. To this day, viewers can feel the seam. The ending of the film almost everyone has seen is not the ending Orson Welles made. His ending no longer exists in any form you can watch. Welles was not the only artist betrayed by the re-editing. The film's score was composed by Bernard Herrmann, the same composer who had scored Citizen Kane and who would later write the music for Psycho, Vertigo, and North by Northwest. Herrmann had written a somber, mournful score that matched Welles's vision. When the studio cut the film, it also cut and rearranged his music, and there was talk of replacing parts of it with work by a staff composer. Herrmann was furious. He had a clause protecting his work, and he invoked it. He demanded that his name be taken off the film entirely rather than have his score altered. The studio complied. If you watch The Magnificent Ambersons today, there is no composer credit for Bernard Herrmann because he refused to be associated with what the studio had done to his music. It is one of the few cases in Hollywood history of a major composer erasing his own credit in protest. Here is the part that turns a sad story into an irreversible one. When a film is cut, the removed footage usually goes into a vault. It can be found again, it can be restored. That is how lost scenes from other films have come back decades later. But that is not what happened here. The footage cut from The Magnificent Ambersons, the roughly 43 minutes that made up Welles's original vision, was physically destroyed. The negative and the outtakes held in RKO's vault in Southern California were junked. The standard account is that the nitrate film stock was melted down to reclaim its silver content for the war effort. Wartime material was valuable. Whatever the exact reason, the result is the same. The footage was not shelved, it was eliminated. There was no master copy waiting to be rediscovered because the studio had turned Welles's lost 43 minutes into raw chemical salvage. The most acclaimed lost footage in cinema history was, in the most literal sense, burned. Welles came back from Brazil to find his film gone cut, re-ended, and stripped of the footage he would need to restore it. Decades later, in a BBC interview, he summed it up in one devastating sentence. "They destroyed Ambersons," he said, and the picture itself destroyed him. He did not get a job as a director for years afterward. it was not an exaggeration. The failure of Ambersons, combined with the expensive collapse of his Brazilian project and Hollywood's existing resentment of him, effectively ended Welles's run as a trusted big studio director. He would spend much of the rest of his career fighting for money and control, making films in fragments, never again handed the resources he'd had at 25. His feud with the situation ran so deep that he reportedly did not speak to his editor, Robert Wise, for over 40 years. The cutting of one film cast a shadow across an entire career. There is one last thread, and it is the reason this story is not entirely closed. Although RKO's records say the footage was destroyed, a faint possibility remains. When Welles was in Brazil, reels of the film had been shipped to him there. After he left, that material was stored at a Brazilian studio, Cinedia, run by a film collector named Adhemar Gonzaga. Years later, RKO reportedly ordered that material destroyed too, and Gonzaga replied that he had complied. But some researchers do not believe a passionate film collector would truly burn a copy of a Welles film. For roughly 30 years, the filmmaker Joshua Grossberg has chased this thread, traveling to Brazil, interviewing collectors, tracking warehouses, hoping that somewhere a print of Welles's original cut still survives, mislaid rather than destroyed. He has called it the greatest mystery in the history of cinema. The odds are long. Most likely, the film is truly gone. But as long as there is a chance a single reel survives in some forgotten collection, the original Magnificent Ambersons is not just a lost film, it is a film someone is still looking for. The Magnificent Ambersons is still, even in its broken form, considered one of the greatest films ever made, which only sharpens the loss. What we celebrate is a fragment, 88 minutes of a film that was meant to run far longer, ending on a note its director never chose, scored by a composer who took his name off it, missing 43 minutes that were cut out and then burned. Orson Welles spent the rest of his life knowing that his second film, the one many thought was his best, had been taken from him and partly destroyed while he was on another continent serving his country. The version we have is not the film he made. It is what survived the studio. And the part that did not survive is the truest missing frame in all of cinema, not hidden, not banned, but burned. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to follow The Missing Frame as we keep uncovering the lost cuts, destroyed footage, and hidden truths behind the films that shape cinema.